what we can do. So thank you everyone for attending. I know that people will keep coming in. My name's Caroline McAvoy. I'm the Leisure Safety Manager for ROSPA. I'm also the founder of Water Safety Scotland. So thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate the time that you're giving us. We know that you're very, very busy people, so please accept our thanks for coming on to this webinar, which focuses on the education resources that Water Safety Scotland has developed and created. So just before we get into a really quick introduction for myself and then pass on to our main speakers, just want to ask, if you are not speaking, if you're not asking questions or speaking, please keep your microphone off. And if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand, because there's quite a few people in the webinar, so just to make it easier. But feel free, if you do have questions, to raise your hand at any time, and we will get you to speak. So thank you. If we can start the presentation, please. Great, okay, perfect, thank you for that. So as I said again, welcome. Thank you so much for your time. Hopefully we will be finished within the time, hopefully a little bit before, but thank you again for coming and listening to us. So very, very quickly, what is Water Safety Scotland? Well, we hope that you may have heard of us before now, but if you haven't, thanks for coming along to hear about us. So Water Safety Scotland is a group that was established back in 2014. Next slide, please, Jen. By the Royal Society for the Prevention of Accidents, and our purpose is essentially to influence, coordinate and lead all the aims set out in Scotland's drowning prevention strategy, which, if you haven't seen or read, it's worthwhile, and quite short, and it does focus quite specifically on education as one of its objectives. But we also help lead and implement huge work streams within the Minister's Action Plan for Water Safety, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. In terms of status, we're a voluntary organisation, and we have very good links with the UK equivalent, which is called the National Water Safety Forum, and also Water Safety Wales, which is very similar to Water Safety Scotland. And nationally as well, we link in with the Scottish Government. So the next slide, hopefully, and we're hoping that this will work nicely, is a QR code, but we are going to actually put the link in the chat for a very, very quick little icebreaker, and just to sort of, you know, see what your knowledge is like in water safety, just so we know where we're at. So if you can, either scan the QR code if you've got a phone, or go onto the chat and go onto the link, click on it, and we will hopefully, I'm going to share my screen.
I'll stop sharing now, Carly.
Perfect. We have 23 people on it, which is fabulous. I'll just move here. So just a really quick little quiz, just to test your knowledge. We'll just see if a couple more people will come on. 29, fantastic. Okay, we'll kick off, and if you haven't joined yet, you can still join. Don't worry, there's time. So one of the first questions, we have 30 players ready. Perfect.
Arlene, you're on mute.
Not sure how that happened. Thank you. 21, if you got that right, absolutely fantastic. But for the others, you'll probably be very interested to know that actually Scotland is is in fact at this moment still the only UK nation to have water safety embedded in the curriculum. So our next question: how many lochs does Scotland have? And don't worry, you'll get the option. Obviously, this is a rough estimation. 30,000 is the estimated number of lochs that Scotland has, which hopefully gives you an insight into how huge amount of water Scotland has inland as well as along those coastal areas, and that doesn't even start to consider some of our rivers and canals. Our next question, 32 players ready, fantastic. What percentage of the UK coastline is in Scotland? And we will give you a clue here. It will include the islands. 60%, those that went for 70, good, but roughly about 60%, which when you consider other countries is absolutely huge. And I think the final question we will have is, what is the average temperature of the seawater in Scotland? Again, this is an average. 15 degrees is the average. Fantastic for those that got it correct. And that does fluctuate. And of course, that doesn't take into account the fact that this is seawater, which tends to be a little bit warmer. If we look at inland waters, it's much, much, much colder. So leaderboard, a lot of people did really well. So fantastic. I will stop sharing my screen and we'll get back to the presentation. But that was just a little icebreaker, hopefully to test some of your knowledge. But essentially, those issues that were on your screen, in particular, the coldness of the water, the extent of the lochs that we have, and the extent of the coastline, not to mention the fact that we have 120 kilometres of rivers, 120 kilometres of canals, is the reason for this number on your screen, or part of the contributory reasons for the next number on the next slide, please, Jen. 96, unfortunately. This is the average number of fatalities in Scotland each year to do with drowning. Of this, 50 are accidental, 29 are suspected suicides, and the rest are classified as not recorded or as crimes. So that is a really huge number, and that average has stayed the same actually over the last few years. And on the next slide, you'll see why is this so important and what's the comparison. Well, this is the rate per population per 100,000. Scotland, as you can see, has a hugely disproportionate rate of drowning. That 96 is massive when you look at the rate. We're basically triple the rate of England, double that of Northern Ireland, and Wales isn't too far behind. So I think that really underlines the real need for Scotland to be really proactive about water safety, about education of our young people, because it's a much more pronounced issue in Scotland than it is in the other UK nations. So next slide, please. And then very quickly, just to give you some insight into these demographics, if you don't already know, actually 9 in 10 of our fatalities in Scotland here are men. And it's mostly those aged over the age of 40, and that's been quite consistent. But I think we all appreciate, and yourselves as educators will appreciate, that education has to start young. It's very difficult to raise awareness and to do projects with that age group. And so it's much easier to give education young and teach about hazards and risks young, so that when they get to this age, hopefully they'll be a little bit more risk aware and aware of the dangers of waters. In terms of location, around 60% of our fatalities happen inland waters, and this has been quite consistent over the last number of years. And most people have drowned as a result of recreational activity. But it's important to underline that actually 1 in 4 people, so 40%, had no intention of being in the water. They were doing everyday tasks. So things like walking, running, cycling, just everyday tasks, and they've actually fallen into the water. Because our waters are so cold, it has resulted in things like cold water shock, which we'll go into a little bit more detail. And lastly, I think it's important to note that yes, there is a spike in summers in terms of when people are drowning, but actually drowning is an all year round issue in Scotland. It does spike, but we also see huge spikes across winter, so it's not something that we can remain silent about. Now that the summer is over, it's actually still so important to look at water safety across winter, to look at ice safety, especially for people walking next to rivers, canals, etc. So essentially, what does all that mean for us? I think, one, as I've said, we need to start education really early, hence this webinar and our appeal to you. 2, we need to concentrate on user activity, but we also need to raise awareness of general water safety, what to do in an emergency, what are the hazards, and that is a lot of what our education resources go into. And then 3, we need to focus all year round, and you'll hear more about what we have to offer in terms of that. And lastly, before we head on, I just want to talk about the actual result of drowning. So one of the biggest, if you go on to the next slide, please, one of the biggest issues is the emotional impact, but also the economic impact. So this number, 1.7 million, is the most recent estimate of what one drowning fatality will cost the UK economy. So if you take into account the 96 fatalities in Scotland, we're talking about a 163 million burden every single year as a result of drowning. And that doesn't include the emotional costs and the psychological costs to family members, to communities. And on this final slide, in this introduction, you'll be able to read a quote. I won't read it out, I'll leave you to read it, but it's a quote from a mum who sadly lost her son to a drowning incident. And she was actually really instrumental in the resources that we've built. And what her quote, as you'll read, really stresses is the importance of why this kind of education is so important, the impact that it has on families, on friends, on communities. So in this webinar today, you'll have heard this introduction from myself. We're now going to move on to Laura and Jen, who will give an overview of these resources, and then we'll move on to Stephen from SFRS, who'll talk about bolt-on additional workshops that complement these resources that can be used in schools, and then we'll go into a bit of a breakout feedback session, question and answer. So I hope that this webinar will give you the information that you need and will also be food for thought, and we can have some great discussions. So I will now hand over to both Laura Erskine and Jen Foley, and I'll quickly introduce them. So Laura is a Water Safety Education Manager for RNOI. She's also the chair of our Water Safety Scotland Education subgroup. And Jen Foley is Water Safety Project Officer for ROSPA and Water Safety Scotland, and also helped with the creation and design of these resources. So please give them your full attention. Thank you very much.
Just waiting for the slideshow to start. Okay, thanks very much, Carleen, for that introduction. As Carleen has mentioned, the work of Water Safety Scotland is driven by the targets of Scotland's Drowning Prevention Strategy, published in 2018, and the Water Safety Action Plan, which was released in 2022 with the support of the Minister for Community Safety. And essentially, this work is to reduce the number of accidental drowning fatalities in Scotland, which, as Carleen mentioned, are disproportionately high in Scotland. So my colleague Laura and I hope to give you a short overview of the journey to introduce water safety education into the Scottish curriculum. And we're really grateful, as Carleen said, for the opportunity to do this. And thank you very much for being here today. So this morning we'll be looking at the background to the development of the water safety education in Scotland, including the strategic influence. We'll look at where the water safety resources sit within the curriculum for excellence and the various resources that are now available. Essentially, there are two banks of resources. One is a general water safety workshop that's aimed to be used with young people aged 14 plus, that can be delivered by anyone working with that age group, such as community teams within Police Scotland and the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service. My colleague Stevie will explain more about this and other workshops later in the webinar. The other set of materials is the Library of Education Resources that has been created to be used by teachers across the different curriculum levels, from early level to senior phase. We'll look at all of the available resources in some detail shortly, and finally we'll look at the future directions for water safety education. So Water Safety Scotland's education subgroup was tasked to address the educational targets of Scotland's Drowning Prevention Strategy, specifically to drive a generational change to facilitate greater education and enjoyment in and around water safety education. The aspiration is to provide better outcomes for communities and increase understanding of the dangers of water so that Scotland's waterways can be enjoyed safely. Some of the reasons that we need to ensure water safety education is delivered to Scotland's children and young people in particular, which we covered in the quiz, include the fact that Scotland has increased opportunities for access to water. As was covered, we've approximately 30,000 lochs and a coastline of around 12 kilometres, covering 60% of the UK's entire coast. And also mentioned in the quiz, the average UK temperature rarely gets above 15 degrees centigrade, and that only gets colder further north here in Scotland, leading to a potentially greater risk of suffering from cold water shock when entering the water. Also, the Land Reform Scotland Act 2003 and Scotland's Outdoor Access Code does enable people in Scotland to enjoy the great outdoors with much less restricted access than our UK neighbours. Work that informed development of the National Water Safety Workshop was in large part thanks to the Fife Water Safety Group, which involved organisations and individuals, including the mum of a teenage boy who sadly lost his life to drowning and has since then campaigned to raise awareness and reduce accidental drowning. Such work shows the strength of collaborative efforts to reduce water-related injury and fatalities. Our hope is that we can continue further collaborative efforts to maximise exposure to the important water safety messages contained within these resources that we're going to talk about. Although the data, as was also covered, points to the age group 40 plus as the most likely to have a water-related fatality or serious incident, a report by Water Safety Scotland was conducted last year, which looked at only the under 25s age range between 2017 and 2021. This revealed a number of key findings, which you can see here on the slide, including that the average age of an accidental drowning fatality within this age group was 18 years. We therefore view water safety education with our children and young people as a vital element in reducing drownings, to improve knowledge and enable them to make more informed and safer decisions when in and around water, as well as knowing how to react in an emergency and potentially save a life. So accidental drowning has been classified by the World Health Organization as the third leading cause of unintentional injury death worldwide. To raise awareness and provide a platform for global advocacy of drowning prevention, the United Nations has designated the 25th of July World Drowning Prevention Day. Water Safety Scotland, along with partners, uses this day to raise awareness of water safety and recently held a large event at Helix Park in Falkirk, the Water Safety Open Day, where we were able to promote our work with young people and families, imparting important advice and promoting knowledge of the water safety codes, which we'll cover shortly, through a number of competitions and interactive activities. We've mentioned already the Water Safety Action Plan, which was released following a spate of tragic drownings in Scotland in July 2021, and also in response to a more general movement towards drowning prevention activity. This release drove the development and implementation of the water safety education resources, which also addressed the key educational target of Scotland's drowning prevention strategy. So as you will all know, Education Scotland is the national improvement agency for education in Scotland. And one of the functions of Education Scotland is to lead and support the successful implementation of the Scottish curriculum. As the Curriculum for Excellence is not statutory and therefore is for educators to decide on the development and implementation of the curriculum within the overall framework, we wanted to ensure there was an easy-to-use lesson available for teachers on the subject of water safety. And the health and wellbeing area, as you'll also know, of the Curriculum for Excellence supports learners to effectively assess and manage risk and understand the impact of risk-taking behaviour. Therefore, it makes sense that water safety education should sit within the health and wellbeing area of the Curriculum for Excellence. Since the release of the Ministerial Water Safety Action Plan in March 2022, there has been real momentum in progress for the Water Safety Scotland Education Subgroup and creation of the resources. These steps on screen show the process from inception to release, which took 1 year, with curriculum levels released as they were created. The planning stage involved working with Education Scotland and using this valuable opportunity to create meaningful and consistent lessons that would inform young people and start those conversations that enable critical thinking on risk, safety, and welfare. The 3-step water safety code was the key message that frames all of the resources, or is the key message rather. The idea behind that being that consistency will lead to familiarity and hopefully retention of the important information. Next was development of the resources. The progression pathway mapped out learning opportunities, keywords, and potential activities for each level. This involved reaching out to children and young people who have played a critical role through focus groups in providing feedback on the resource development. as well as experts such as Education Scotland, particularly around welfare considerations. Finally is promotion of the resources, which is still ongoing, hence today's session. We developed a comms plan to raise awareness via social media and partner social media, such as Twinkle Scotland, following each curriculum level release. This session today is so important to us in terms of letting educators know that the resources are available to be used. We want to work with teachers and schools to capture how best the resources would sit and be delivered in class. It really needs to be a two-way conversation to ensure the resources are accessible and utilised, meaning that the key messages are reaching learners. So our next step is evaluation of the resources. We want to know that they're being used and, crucially, what teachers and pupils think of them. Independent evaluation of the resources will be done by students at Abertay University. We're delighted to have been able to offer the evaluation to final year students as an internship, thus continuing the educational theme. The evaluators aim to show that the intended learning has taken place by assessing knowledge before and after the water safety lessons. They will also undertake focus group interviews with pupils and teachers. The final evaluation report will inform next steps, and it would be so useful if schools can let us or the evaluators know when they intend to and have used the resources, as we're not able to track downloads specific to user. It would also be very useful to know who would be happy to be involved in the evaluation, and we can cover that a little bit later. But for now, I'll thank you for your time, and I'll now pass over to Laura Erskine, who will go over the resources in more detail. Thank you.
Thanks, Jen. So now we're going to have a look at the Water Safety Code. So as mentioned, this is a 3-step code, which is designed to be easy to remember. And when you look at all of the resources, you'll see that that's kind of the golden thread, which ties all of those resources together. And it's been applied to all levels of the water safety resources and also to the separate national workshop, which has been mentioned. Having a consistent message is really, really important to reinforce the core safety messaging. We believe that the more engagement a young person has with the code, they'll be able to firstly avoid being in an emergency situation because they're able to identify hazards and dangers, but they can also recall the steps if they need to, if they find themselves in difficulty in the water, or if they see someone else in difficulty in the water. We're really pleased to report that this code has been incorporated into Scottish Swimming School Swimming Lesson Framework, meaning that there will be consistency between both classroom and practical learning. Thank you, Jen. So as part of the planning process, we mapped out a progression pathway, which essentially maps out water safety education from early level through to the senior phase. This is essentially the blueprint for the National Water Safety Workshop and also the curriculum levels, and as mentioned, was created in collaboration with children and young people. This was an incredibly important aspect of the planning, and the honest feedback from the young people was really important as it steered the direction of the creation of the resources, and also was really useful to get their insight and attitude into their attitudes towards water safety in general. Thanks, Jen. So the core water safety education resources have been developed and implemented for every stage of the curriculum, from early level through to the senior phase. We reached out for guidance and expertise from Education Scotland so we could create resources and guidance which are applicable to each level and consist of the appropriate activities, pedagogy and welfare considerations, which is of course important when talking to young people about such a sensitive subject. Whilst we encourage practitioners to embrace the consistency of the Water Safety Code and cascade those to your pupils, we also acknowledge that flexibility is a really important element, and therefore there is room to pick and choose the suggested activities whilst not sacrificing on the vital Water Safety Code. Each stage consists of a lesson plan, a PowerPoint presentation, and an extension activities to support the core learning. And the only stage which doesn't have a PowerPoint is the early level overview, which we'll take a look at on an upcoming slide. These resources are freely available to teachers or anyone, in fact, and they're available on both the Water Safety Scotland website, but also available on the Education Scotland National Improvement Hub. As mentioned, we've been working alongside Education Scotland who have provided really useful guidance for each level of the curriculum. As mentioned, all levels comprise of a lesson plan, except from the early level. As the early level has a kind of overview of suggestions for the interactions, experiences, and so on. But all the levels additionally come with a PowerPoint, and some included videos, extension activities to stretch children and young people's understanding of risk around water and how to keep themselves safe. All of the levels also are supported by core terms and vocab, which will of course help for engagement with with the context of this. We do suggest for all levels that you consider if there's been any water-related fatalities or near misses in the community that may upset the young people you work with. Next slide, Jen. Thank you. So if we just have a quick look at the early level overview, just to give you a sense of what it looks like. As mentioned, there's no PowerPoint for this level. But what we did do, we worked with Education Scotland to gain a useful insight into each specific level in the hope that we would provide resources that are useful, realistic and meaningful for each level. Just bearing in mind that we are not we're not education practitioners, so we wanted to acknowledge that and ensure we're working with the experts so we can provide teachers across Scotland with resources which will be valuable. So the early level resource includes an overview rather than a lesson plan and provides suggestions for experiences, spaces and interactions. We want to ensure anything created was not so prescriptive and that practitioners at this level have the flexibility to encourage water safety learning with the suggested activities. Next slide, Jen. We're going to go on to have a quick look at an example activity. So I've taken this from the first level resource. And the activity, you'll see here that all the activities are linked to one of the core elements of the water safety code. However, this activity relates to two. It relates to stop and think, spot the dangers, but also stay together, stay close. So I really like this activity. It's a really nice way of talking to the children and young people about both the positive and negative behaviours around water. I think it's really important to not only draw their attention to how not to behave around water, but also to reinforce positive messaging so they know what to do and also encourage them that they can have fun around water, but they just have to be safe. So if you were to download this, as I mentioned, for free, download it from our website and also the National Improvement Hub. When you click on these cards, they will explain if they're safe or unsafe. Now, of course, you would guide that young person through these cards, and there's lots to talk about here. So you can see the first one is all about ice safety. So it's about the depth of the water and how cold it is. And I think that's a really important message as we approach the cooler months. And sadly, in the last few years, we have seen some really tragic drownings relating to kind of cold water and ice safety. So a really kind of important message. But you would go through these and you would encourage, you would link it back to the core messaging. So of course, if we look at the second card there, the lady's on her phone and she's maybe not paying attention to her child in the water. So that's all about staying together, stay close, being mindful of the risks. But we're also underlining the positive ways to be safe. So the paddle boarders are together. They're wearing the right equipment. They're wearing wetsuits and life jackets. Really important message, you know, underlining how to enjoy water safely. And then the last one there, a nice kind of discussion to have with your pupils. You know, you can have fun, but stay together, stay close. You know, these children they're playing by the water, but in a group, and they're a safe distance from the water, from the edge. So just an example there for the first level where you could talk about water safety in a nice, clear way and provide examples of both kind of negative behaviours and reinforce safe behaviours. Next slide, Jen. Thank you. So the senior phase activities are, of course, reflective of the approach to learning at that level. And just to note that lots of the learning around this level is discussion based. We've actually created 2 different lessons for the senior phase. This one, which the activity is taken from, is a resource we've created specifically around the dangers of consuming alcohol near or in water. At the beginning of the webinar, Jen noted the report on accidental drownings of under 25s, and it's really important to note there that of those drownings, intoxication was suspected in 35% of the fatalities. So we believe, therefore, that it's really important to have these discussions on the consequences of consuming alcohol and being intoxicated near or in water. You know, some of those effects which are related to the core messaging would include, you know, the fact that your judgment might be impaired, it slows down your reaction time, which makes swimming difficult, it can affect decision making, and you may think you're warmer than you are, which has a really strong link to cold water shock. You know, going back to how the temperature of water in and around Scotland is very cold, even on a warm summer day, you know, people can still be affected by cold water shock. So we think this is a kind of this activity here just provides you with a structure of how you could talk to young people at this level about alcohol and water. So again, it relates to stop and think, spot the dangers, and it asks them to talk about what additional dangers might alcohol bring to this scenario, and how might alcohol increase the effects of cold water shock. You do have the guidance notes as well, which you can refer back to those. And there's a challenge question at the bottom to stretch those young people. Next slide, please, Jen. So separately, as Jen mentioned, we've created a national water safety workshop, which sits outside of the curriculum resources. This resource is specifically designed to be rolled out to young people over the age of 14 and can be delivered without the need for prior knowledge of the subject or a teaching background. It's 14 plus because we do have a couple of videos which are particularly sensitive, and we've been advised to not roll that out to anyone under the age of 14. The national workshop can be used by youth groups. It can also be used by community engagement officers with Police Scotland and the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, and that can be delivered as a standalone water safety session within school or community settings. There's also an ice safety workshop and an alcohol one which are separate, and they can also be used with groups aged 14 and over. We're really keen, as I just mentioned, that we push this out in the colder months so we can provide that important safety information to children and young people to keep them safe over the winter. Next slide, please, Jen. Thank you. As we've already covered, we want to ensure that the water safety resources are received well by all stakeholders. Therefore, the resources will be independently evaluated by students at Abertay University. We also want to ensure that our non-mainstream learners can benefit from the important messages within the water safety resources, and we hope to develop resources for use within non-mainstream educational settings in the future. We're really proud to be the first and still only UK nation to have water safety education embedded into the curriculum, and hope that these resources can be used for years to come to improve the skills and knowledge relating to water safety among our children and young people. And yeah, that's it from myself and Jen for this component of the webinar. And yeah, just thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join, and thank you for listening.
We'll make sure we put the links out actually in a follow-up email, just so you have all these. Is there any other questions before I introduce Stevie to give us an overview of the bolt-on additional workshops? There'll be time hopefully later as well, because we're a little bit ahead of time. So if you think of questions, don't be shy, please just either use the chat or raise your hand. Okay then, so I'd like to introduce Stevie McCreath now. So Stevie is a watch commander with Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, and SFRS are obviously one of our key partners as well. Stevie has over 22 years of experience, 16 of which has actually been at the water rescue stations across Glasgow. So we'll ask Stevie to present on these bolt-on workshops which complement the education resources that can be used.
Hi, thanks Caroline, thanks Jen and Laura. I am just going to hopefully share the screen. Okay, good morning. As Caroline says, Stephen McCreath, I've got 22 years experience with the fire service. 16 of them have been at a water rescue station. I've seen the good and unfortunately the bad of persons in the water trapped. I've had many positive outcomes in the water, but unfortunately have unsuccessful, outcomes in the water. So this is a good resource that's been developed by Water Safety Scotland, and I'm keen for it to get pushed. I'm obviously here with the fire service badge behind us and my uniform, but today I'm working with Water Safety Scotland. I've been there for 4 or 5 months as a secondment, so I'm enjoying my time here, so I will get on. Available workshops, we've got the National Water Safety Workshop. This was developed first, and as Jen and Laura says, this is a standalone water safety resource, and it's different in terms of its intended use. It's intended for 14 to 16-year-old groups, 4th year to 6th year, and we've found it very positive. The feedback we've had when the course and the class has been delivered has been positive feedback. And again, I think, as Laura says, it's the golden thread of the stop and think and the stay close in an emergency runs all the way through these presentations. There is, as Jen says or Caroline says, there is a primary education resource currently in development. It should be available soon. I dare say there will be an email out, or the website will be updated to reflect when that resource becomes available. The ICE workshop and the alcohol workshops, they were created, actually came from a partner. They requested the availability of the resource because they were going out to do teaching, and they found there was no available resources. So they approached Water Safety Scotland, and Water Safety Scotland did create the ICE and the alcohol resource. In essence, it follows the national workshop, probably 12 to 14 slides long, but the ICE one obviously just has the more weighted towards, the winter ice, keeping yourself safe round about it, and the alcohol. Again, is the same messages getting passed through the whole presentation, but obviously just with the side of alcohol related to it. So good resources, lesson plans have been created extensively for all packages. They are very easy to use, and there is extensive and really good speaker notes for the 3 packages that you can see on the screen at the moment. It is intended to be used by non-teachers, folk that don't have a background in teaching, and you don't have to be capable of doing that. The wording has been created, and it's very useful. So yeah, very good asset, and we've had positive feedback from it. Here's a snapshot of 3 of the particular slides that are contained within the National Water Safety Workshop. And again, as we've mentioned, throughout the presentation today, the stop and think, spot the dangers, the stay close together, and what to do in emergency. You can see there from the slides that it goes all the way through every slide. These three topics are being covered. Just for example, the first one, activity 1, the stop and think, spot the dangers. I don't know how well you can see on the graphics there, but it's a river, a typical river running through a glen, and the interactive between the presenter and the students would basically be to ask questions about that body of water. What kind of dangers do you see within that water? So you won't be able to see it from the picture, but on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side of the top left picture, the bank is slightly eroded. The water's shallow to the right-hand side, but over the other side it's deep. So we're asking questions about, the depth of the water, how fast the flow of the water is. The water's obviously cold. As you can see there from that picture, it looks as if it's sunny, so it obviously wasn't taken this year. But if it was a winter picture with cold and snow, I don't think many folk would be, stripping off to cross the water, because they would expect the water to be freezing cold. But in reality, the water is probably only 3 or 4 degrees warmer in summer than it is in the winter. So it's just an interactive dialogue between the students and the presenter, and it gets them thinking. And again, it's about spotting the dangers, looking at your environment round about you and seeing what dangers are there and trying to work them out. The second picture, the middle one, is the stay together, stay close, and that picture is a representation of half a dozen young persons. It looks like they're running into a beach or waterfront setting. So the conversation there would look like what kind of activities would take place down at the water. So we've got open swimming, open water swimming, we've got paddle boarding, kayaking. Again, folk go to have a look at caves. So it's all about staying close together. If you're together, you're obviously safer. If you go and do paddle boarding on your own, you get into difficulty. There's nobody else there to look after you. If you go and do it in a group of people, then you've got a better chance of getting help and assistance. Again, talking about caving, we've seen situations where folk haven't been properly prepared and planned, and they've went away and they've got trapped by the tides when they've been away looking at caves. That's something that happens regularly. So this particular slide is talking about staying close together, the importance of being in a group. Should you get any difficulty, you've obviously got better chance of receiving help, but also being prepared and planning. So that would be mobile phones, knowing exactly where you are. No point phoning 999 to say I'm in Loch Lomond. Whereabouts in Loch Lomond are you? I don't know. I can see trees, so it's enforcing the idea that you really need to know where you are in the event of an emergency, so the emergency services can come and assist you. So it's planning, it's talking about packing your mobile phones and waterproof bags, and checking tides, etc. Again, not every young person is going to do that, but if there's a group of 4 or 5 of them going away, one of them may do it, and that may be the difference between a positive outcome as opposed to the other. And you can see there from the bottom right, that's just a small pictogram of cold water shock. So that's really just explaining in a pictogram what cold water shock is. So the idea with cold water shock is in the first 60 seconds to 90 seconds, your body will go into cold water shock. You'll hyperventilate, you're probably going to panic, and you're going to try and swim. That's been proven not the correct thing to do. So purpose of this slide would be to enforce to the young persons what to do in the event of cold water shock. It would be try and calm yourself down, try and relax yourself. After 60 seconds or so, your body will calibrate, and then the advice is get onto your back, create a star-shaped position, put your arms and legs out, and then you can float. You're still inside the 3 minutes, you still have full use of your body. The cold hasn't yet started to take hold of your muscles and render them, not working. And then at that point, you can get yourself a plan to get yourself out. But that may well be if you're on your own. But if you're with a group, then that group could also shout to the person in the water to do this, because they're obviously maybe not going to be thinking straight because they're in that situation, and that other person would be expected to then make the emergency call. And that's, as we said earlier on, knowing exactly where you are. It may well be looking at signposts. If it's Loch Lomond, for example, there's signage that tells you exact locations. So it's all about covering the individual in the water and trying to keep them safe. A good example I've seen used in schools for that example is we had an ice bucket full of water, and we put a couple of bags of ice cube in it, and we got the young persons to simulate a task. So we had a threaded bolt and a nut, and we got them to put their hands in the ice bucket for 3 minutes, and then we timed them. So I timed them prior to putting their hands in the bucket, screwing the nut in the bolt, and then after they had been in the ice bucket, we timed them again, and the time was slower. So it really is just about proving, cold water shock's a thing. It does affect your muscles. It does affect your ability to do things that wouldn't normally cause you any issues. So that is the golden thread, as Laura had said earlier on. Stop and think, stay close, and in emergency, who do you call? How do you know where you are, and to make the right call so you can get help. Go on to the next slide. The National Water Safety Workshop, as Jen and Laura had mentioned, there is a 14 or a 16-year-old rating on it, and it's because of these 2 particular videos. The one on the left is Cameron's story, and this is a young boy, Cameron Lancaster. He's actually from East Coast of Scotland, and he tells his mum has kindly undertook to assist in the making of the video. She's telling the story of her son, who was a swimmer, and he was a sailor, so he understood and he knew the dangers of being in and around water. He wasn't a novice to water, but it was probably before COVID or during COVID when the Ice Bucket Challenge stuff was all going on, and he was going to do the Ice Bucket Challenge. And his mum's basically just telling the story of what happened. The way he did his ice bucket challenge was in a quarry, at the top of the quarry. He done his challenge at the top of the quarry, and then he jumped from the quarry into the water. But unfortunately, the wind or some other situation, he didn't hit the water correctly. And it tells the story, unfortunately, that he broke his neck as he entered the water. And his friends were all there. They were all videoing it as part of the ice bucket challenge. They thought he was kidding on. They were all laughing and joking. As it worked out, the boy had died, and I think the police divers got him later on that day or the next day. So it's his mum basically telling the story that she knew he was going to go and do this. She asked him not to do it, and that was the last words that she spoke to him. So it's an impactful video from a family member who's talking about, you know, the loss after the death of her son. And she talks about the boys. There was a dropout at university, 4 or 5 of them dropped out of university, you know, in the first year. So it affects everybody. And again, just friends in the street. She's seen now with driving lessons and getting married. Everybody else's life's moving on, but Cameron's, unfortunately, he's not here. So it's a very good video, not the right word for it, a good video, but that video, when that get played in a high school, I seen it in Glasgow, was, you could have heard the pin drop in the room. It was a very, very good video. The video on the left-hand side, the right-hand side, sorry, is an actor. He's a young boy, and he's basically, again, just telling the story of going down to the river at the weekend, him and his pal betting them to swim across the river, and he decides to do it. And he talks about taking off his trainers and his good tracksuit bottoms because his mum will kill him if he gets them dirty. And he goes into the water, and then the tank, he's actually, the video there doesn't play, it's just a screen grab of it, but the boy's in a tank, and then as he's telling the story, there's a water level behind him that basically starts to fill up, and that's him simulating basically drowning. And he tells his story of how he goes into the water's okay, and then all of a sudden the water becomes freezing cold. He then goes into cold water shock, his legs and his arms don't work, he sinks to the bottom, and then the currents take him away. And that's him telling his story of how he ended up in the water. So 2 really, really good videos, and again, they're only 4 or 5 minutes long each of them, but again, when they're played, you can hear a pin drop with them. So yeah, really good resources. We mentioned Ice Safety Workshop. Ice Safety Workshop was created following a request from one of our partners. I think it was the fire service, that they had nothing left there. So it was created following the death of 3 boys in Solihull in 2002. They fell through the ice and basically died. They were found in the ice. They had to get rescued, you know, a period of time later. So it was something that the fire service were keen to get involved in, as were other agencies. So they contacted Water Safety Scotland. They spoke and they created these ice workshops, which will be available to get delivered, you know, probably after the summer as we start getting into autumn, as we look to the colder weather. But again, it's just talking about cold water shock, how to protect yourself if you do end up in the water, and how do you know who to call. It's talking about staying close, and it gives advice on, you know, don't go into the water to try and rescue somebody, or don't go into the ice to try and rescue someone. Try and find, you know, life equipment that's round about, if it is round about. So again, it follows a similar vein to the national workshop, but it's just got a winter connotation on it. So again, good piece of work. So far, where have these workshops been delivered? The Renfrewshires and Inverclyde, it's been delivered to 7,500 S4 to S6 pupils. East Ayrshire and South Ayrshire, all secondary school pupils have had it delivered to them. North Ayrshire has been delivered online, and water safety input's been delivered to the primary schools, delivered to certain primary schools in East Ayrshire as part of their danger detectors programme. That's obviously what Laura was talking about earlier on. Stirling and Clacks, they've delivered it to all 33 high schools, and in 2022, 74 face-to-face inputs had taken place between S4 to H6, so really good uptake and good engagement between the partners and the schools. Lanarkshire, all 14 high schools, roughly 4,000 pupils in S4 to S6 have got it, and they're looking to deliver through youth clubs through the summer holidays that were just finished just there. So it's a really good resource. As I say, it's doesn't have to be, you know, teacher backgrounds, it's delivering it. It's very well written. Lecture or training or learning materials are all there, very well written, and it's a really good piece of kit. A wee testimonial here from one of our firefighters that was delivering it in Clackmannanshire. Not going to read it out, but basically saying it's a really good resource, and the staff and the pupils found it engaging. From what I've seen of it in a couple of the schools that I've seen it getting presented in, it is a really good resource, and the young people do engage with it because it's real to them. They are all thinking about at the weekend we're going to use our free bus passes and we're going to go somewhere to water our quarries. So when you're telling these stories, it does get them thinking. So yeah, it's good resource. Who do you contact in order for assistance with this? Obviously, well, it can be delivered standalone by any individual. I've seen it delivered twice in Glasgow, where I worked. We're lucky we have water rescue stations in the north of the city and the south of the city. And this particular school was in the south, so they contacted the local fire station. They made an appointment, and the local station turned up with the water rescue tender. This is a Mercedes Sprinter van, fully kitted out with all the water rescue stuff, and they also brought their inflatable Zodiac boat. So that turned up at the school, and there was a wee show and tell session after it, which again went down really well. But if you have a police liaison within the school, contact them. They should be able to link in with the fire service and the ambulance service, and also, as it says on the screen there, community groups and other school settings, Cubs, Scouts, the guides, you know, running clubs, anybody who's really looking for it. If they can contact the fire service, it'll be on the contact page. Somebody from their community action team should get back to you and hopefully make an arrangement to come out and assist with the visit. That's my short presentation finished. So I'll do my thank yous and any questions. I will just turn that off, hopefully.
Great, thank you so much, Stevie. That was a fantastic presentation. Really useful to see how yourselves as SFRS and other organisations can really help support the core activities. So thank you. Do we have any questions for Stevie at the moment before we maybe take just a 2-minute break and then organise our breakout sessions? Absolutely. So I think then, thank you, Jen, for sharing your screen. Thank you all for your contributions to this. The Jamboard will stay open for a day or so. So if you want to come back, if you get a little bit more time or have a thought, please, after you've maybe actually looked at the resources in a bit more detail, please do come back, add some notes. As I say, it is anonymous, and we're always happy for the feedback. So I think we'll sort of end the webinar. I'm going to open up if there's any last comments or questions anyone wants to ask that haven't been covered, but feel free, as we've said, to get in touch with us direct. I think Laura had put the email in the chat. We'll put it in again just in case. We're always available basically to talk about these resources and to answer any questions. So is there any other great, sorry, I'm reading the chat whilst thinking, is there any other questions, or are you quite happy to get a whole 8 minutes of your time back? Appreciate, again, you're all very busy. Some of this is absolutely brand new to you. I hope that you can see the importance of water safety, you can see the passion and the development that's gone into these resources from my colleagues, and that it's something that you will use. And if it's not, that you will feed back to us to tell us how we can improve it so that you can and will use it. So if there's no questions, I'd like to just again thank you all so much for taking the time out of your day to come listen to us and hear these presentations, and thank Jen, Laura and Stevie for their contributions and their fantastic presentations.